lounging, son.
All right, welcome back to the Comic Lounge. My name is Ryan, and with me today, I have another awesome guest for you guys. I have Dan Jurgens. He has done some of my favorite stories of DC Comics. You got a new one coming out that I'm very excited for. Created one of my favorite characters, Booster Gold. Death of Superman. I mean, just so much stuff that I want to get into with you. So welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. Good to be here, Ryan.
So first off, I know that we, like I said before we recorded, that we had done a written interview, but I like to ask everybody the first time that they, we do the video stuff, a little bit of their backstory on how they got into comic books and what in turn inspired them to become a creator themselves.
How I got into it? Well, for me, it was, the Batman TV series, the original live version from the 60s is what really got me interested. Because prior to that, I had never even owned a comic book. I had never held a comic book. And I got into the TV show. And then one night I was walking through the neighborhood and a couple of kids were sitting on their front stoop. And they're a little older than me. And they had all these magical 4-color adventurous pamphlets called comics sitting there. Some of them even had Batman in them. And as soon as I saw it and saw everything that they had, I realized, you mean Batman has a life outside of TV and more adventures that I can check out? And that's what really lit the fire to get me interested. So it started with that.
Okay. And I mean, like, you don't just draw, you do both. So like, you are like complete cartoonist. You do it all yourself. You've created many characters. When did you make that decision that you wanted to get into comic books? And in turn, if I remember correctly, an issue of Warlord was your first published work? Or is that?
Yeah, my first published work was Warlord number 63. That was my first pro gig. And I don't know that it was as pure as making a decision that I wanted to get into comic books. I was working at that time as a graphic designer and illustrator, and comics were something I had interest in, but I was also, really already getting pretty successful in the stuff I was doing. And it just kind of became a thing where I kept drawing stuff that was related to comics. I kept being interested in it. And at one point, Mike Grell was making an appearance at a comic book store here in town. And I said, well, I'm going to go stop in and say hi, because I've always liked this man's work. And I stopped. I had my portfolio with me. I showed him what I was doing, which was at that time a lot of military illustrations, space shuttle illustrations, things like that, as well as some of my side comic book stuff. And Mike liked it right away. He said, you should send this in to our editor, Lori Sutton, which I did. And they were also in the process of looking for a new artist on Warlord. They said, well, here, try a script. So I did a few pages, sent it in. They liked that. They said, go ahead and finish it, which was Warlord 63. And I've been hanging around ever since.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you've done so much of my favorite stories. Like, to me, you're my definitive Superman artist, because like when I got into Superman, you were on the book, and it was shortly before you guys killed him,
Right. Okay.
So, but like that, those were like my real formative years in terms of my comic book reading. And then, like the artists and writers that really resonated with me. So can you take us from, you started with Warlord, and then how that eventually led into you, not just drawing Superman, but you were writing and drawing Superman. And I'd love for you maybe to also expand on, the decision behind doing such a groundbreaking thing with such a major character.
Well, so, there's a lot there. In terms of how I kind of moved from Warlord into Superman, there were a couple of steps along the way. One of which is I co-created a series called Sun Devils for DC that was written, the writer end of it was created by Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway. And then Jerry was writer-editor. And I was drawing that. Jerry got really overloaded on his schedule and wasn't going to be able to finish off writing the 12-issue maxi series. And it was something where I had always expressed interest in writing. Jerry and I talked over the plots. I'd write dialogue notes in the borders, things like that. And so Jerry just said, well, if I can't write this, why don't you? You know the characters, you know the story, you have interest in it. And that took me into that. And once I had that taste of writing under my belt, I wasn't about to let it go, because that was sort of a really golden age of writer artists. I had mentioned Mike Grell. We also had like Jim Starlin and Howard Chaykin and John Byrne, and I'm sure I'm forgetting many more, but a lot of guys were writing and drawing their own stuff. And I always found sort of a purity of vision in efforts like that, and I wanted to be a part of that. And I also brought Booster Gold to DC, which I was writing and drawing as well. So, you know, I was really building my credibility as a writer slash artist, because I did want to do both. Not necessarily all the time. I'd write for others, I'd draw for others, but I kind of wanted that to be the core at that time. And then when Booster Gold got canceled, that's when they started talking to me about Superman, and I moved to that.
Dude, that's I mean, yeah, like I said, like your Superman, every image of Superman that comes to mind first is always from that era, from like one of the ones you drew. And, you know, like even looking back on it, you know, as I've gotten older, because like I've read the story multiple times, but I know that a lot of shakeups were happening in terms of like Marvel and DC, and it's kind of seems like a lot of it was having to do with like image and what was like a certain era. There was kind of like a I mean, they call it kind of like the dark age of comics. I've seen some people refer to it. I don't really think it's a dark age. I don't see that. But you know, Batman's backbreaking, Superman dying. But like Batman's backbreaking seemed like a little bit more darker tone than the Superman death. Like that more celebrated like who this character was and what the symbol mean to so many others. What was the decision behind killing him off? Like, where did that idea kind of germinate from?
Again, there's kind of a lot to deal with here.
Yeah.
First of all, if people are out there calling it the dark age of comics,
Yeah.
it must only be because they have no awareness of what it really was. The
Yeah.
truth of that time in comics is we were selling a lot of books. You know,
Mhm.
the Death of Superman stuff and everything else we did, we were selling a lot. The X books were selling a lot. When the
Mhm.
Image books came out, they were selling a lot. The Batman, you know, broken back storyline did. And what happened is we were bringing new readers into this industry, some of which are still around.
Mhm.
So I find it hard to believe that efforts that were that successful could ever be called, you know, a dark age of comics.
Well, I
When
mean more
now,
so in tone. I
well,
meant
I
more so in
understand.
tone. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
understand what you mean, but really, I mean, right now you get excited, creators who get excited if they sell 30,000 copies of something. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, for
wow, big
sure.
deal. Um,
Yeah.
you know, so, but to go back to that, the thing about Superman is we were 4 books, and that meant there was almost a Superman title weekly. We had Man of Steel, Adventures of Superman, Action Comics, and Superman itself.
Mhm.
And every now and then we would combine the books into what was almost like a weekly comic. And we had sort of built that technique starting with 2 books, then it became 3, and then 4 when Man of Steel joined, and sort of had perfected our storytelling technique by that point. So that when it became time to tell big stories, we were able to do that. And we had already experimented that with stories like, you know, Dark Knight over Metropolis, Crisis of the Crimson Kryptonite. And so we had already developed our storytelling methodology that we found allowed us to tell us really big stories.
Mhm.
So we would get together from time to time. I know there's sort of this insinuation out there that we were reacting to Image when we did this. When we planned the Death of Superman, I think the only book from Image that might have been out at that point was Youngblood. I think later the marketing effort reflected Image's incredible success. But when we planned it, we were just trying to tell a good story.
Mhm.
And I know I had walked in, I had a yellow legal pad, and I had 2 ideas scribbled on it because, you know, you don't write it out in detail. And one was Death of Superman, and the other one was Monster Crashes Metropolis. And at that time, Superman had a lot of non-physical foes. You know, Lex Luthor was a businessman. Brainiac wasn't really a physical foe. We had another character called Mr. Z, and he was not. And I just wanted to draw a knockdown, drag out, epic sort of fight that would plow through the city of Metropolis between Superman and somebody. And in my head, I just said monster. We also talked about the death of Superman, because that had been sort of a classic story done years earlier. And we wondered, what could we do with it? It had come up in previous meetings. And even in this one, we talked about it. We moved on and off the topic. Jerry Ordway, over in the other corner of the room, kind of got us back to it, said, well, yeah, maybe we should kill him. And then we spent some time talking about it, because it wasn't just the concept of doing the death of Superman. It was, what could we say about Superman if we did that? And really, we spent so much time talking about that, about how you could address Superman's importance by removing him from the comic and having all the characters in the DC universe react to that, that then became something we really started to hone in and focus on. And we talked about it being televised. And we talked about, Ma and Pa Kent seeing their son die on TV, yet not being able to tell anybody that was Clark. Same kind of thing for Lois. And we really started to get into it. We discussed, well, should it be Luthor who does it or somebody else? And we kind of came back to the monster idea, which had been two totally different ideas at that point. And the monster fused into this idea as we focused on, maybe it should be somebody new. And maybe it'd be this character that is a force of nature. So through all of us working at it, and by that I mean the writers, the artists, everybody who worked on the books, being in a conference room, we really started to build out the story based on how we could address Superman's level of importance to the world. And where we got very fortunate is that not only did we write about that in the fictional stories, but that once Superman was gone, we had columnists in the real world writing stories that said something like, what does it say about us that Superman is no longer being published? So we had the real world sort of doing this weird kind of coincidental duality sort of thing with what we were publishing at the exact same time. So it worked out extraordinarily well.
And then did you guys have okay, you guys decided on the death. Was there ever a timeline that you're like, okay, this is how long he's going to be gone before we bring him back? Because it also birthed like a couple of my favorite characters. Steel is one of my favorite DC characters. He's on the Superman show now. Connor Kent is another favorite of mine. He wasn't Connor back then, but Superboy. And then right. So many awesome characters came from this. But what was the game plan in terms of how long we're going to push this? Or were you kind of like, well, let's see how long this works. Let's see how many stories we can get. And then then we'll figure out an ending.
Well, in that meeting and at that time, what we knew is this, and that is that we were going to have Superman die in Superman 75, and then we would run the books for 2 months after that. And then we would get to Superman 77 or that month and just stop publishing the Superman books, which was really so much a part of the illusion of what it is we were trying to build. As creators, we looked at it and said, yay, we get a break. But, we knew there might be a couple of specials or things like that. And we knew that the next issue up would logically be Adventures of Superman 500. But when we walked out of that meeting, we did not know when or how Superman was going to come back. We had no plan. We just knew he was going to die. We really had no plan as to how he would come back. And then, Superman 75 came out in November of 92. We got together, I want to say it was, mid-October of 92. That was our next meeting as a group. And at that point, Mike Carlin, who was our editor, said, the entire world is watching for us to screw up, so this has to be good. And we started to talk about how Superman would come back. And as I recall, each of the 4 creative teams kind of had their own ideas about how this might work out. We were all kind of struggling to find the right answer because we wanted it to be epic. And I have this memory of Louise Jones kind of saying, "Oh, it's too bad we can't all do our own idea," or something. Just that sort of offhand remark that lit the fuse of us exploring that as a concept. And it's like, then we got on to, well, what if we each did a separate Superman? And that's where Steel was born, and that's where Superboy was born, and the idea of bringing back the Eradicator, and then me even saying, well, what if one is a bad guy, and then me doing the cyborg Superman. So, I've always found it fascinating that people thought of this as a giant marketing stunt.
Mhm.
All we were ever trying to do is tell a good story, right? I mean, it's not like you set out to tell a bad story. We
Mhm.
all want to tell good stories. We want the stories to sell. That's all we ever were trying to do. And when we did it, we really did not have a concrete plan as to how or when he was coming back.
I mean, I think it's a testament to the story and how good it is, because it still resonates with people to this day. I've read it multiple times from a kid to like as recent as like a year ago. I read it again, and I think it's one of my favorite Superman stories. I mean, it's been adapted into animated film, which I think was phenomenal. It was a great adaptation, and you're coming up on the 30th anniversary not long from now. So I'm kind of curious. I don't know if there are any plans. Do you know of anything to kind of like celebrate? I mean, because that's a huge milestone, 30 years, and it was such an epic story. Are there any plans to kind of celebrate that?
We've actually had a few discussions along those lines. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen, but I've been approached about it, so we'll see what happens. I think that it's a reasonable thing to do just because of what you mentioned. The animated films only came out a couple of years ago. We also had the Batman versus Superman live action movie, which used a lot of that. And because of all of that and the fact that the book stays in print, it's something that still resonates with people. And if you go back to that time and this idea of, the millions of copies that we sold and the way it is managed to still stay a part of Superman's life, I actually think it's something that people would very much like to see.
I mean, I'm here for it, and I hope something is definitely done with it. I do want to talk a little bit of Booster Gold. Like the creation of him in the '80s, and then like you did that awesome run with his solo series prior to Flashpoint. I've been itching for some new Booster Gold, and you're bringing Blue and Gold into the mix. So before you talk about the new book and kind of how that came to be, if you could talk about a little bit your idea behind the creation of Booster Gold and why you think that he is still, like after all these years, still such a fan favorite.
Well, so I think let's address the fan favorite type status first. And I think some of that is because of his imperfections. When I created Booster and brought him to DC, most of DC's characters were still kind of at that level of perfection that embodied all their characters, right? I mean, Superman was perfect, Batman was close to it. I mean, they were like, the Justice League was like a team of people without faults, and so I wanted to do somebody who was imperfect, where they might have the right idea and might want to function as a hero. But you know what? If they made a few bucks doing it, what's wrong with that? Because that's kind of how the world really works. And especially at that time, there was sort of, I think, a new level of celebrity culture that was emerging, as well as this idea that Olympic athletes might no longer have to be amateurs, that they could be people who made money doing what they do, who would get paid, who could market themselves, all of that. So it was all of those things that went into this idea of who Booster Gold could be. And that became sort of the inspiration of the character. But then in terms of how he fit into DC, everybody there was so noble that I think it's more interesting to read about someone who does not have that level of nobility. And I've always said, Superman is the guy who flies up in the air when a plane is going to crash. He catches it perfectly, so much so that anyone sitting on board does not even spill a drop of their drink. He flies it over and lowers it down gently into the Metropolis airport, and everybody's cool. If Booster sees it, he calls CNN first, says, I'm going to go do this. You should film it. Then he gets up to the plane. he can't handle it. So as it's coming down, the wings clip a couple of office towers, people spill their drinks, a couple of people break arms because they're getting tossed all over inside the plane. And then eventually he barely gets it lowered down into the middle of like Times Square, where it ties up traffic for the next 4 days. That's how Booster does it. He does the right thing, but it's much harder for him to do it. But I think that makes him a little more relatable to people in
Mhm.
some ways. And I think that's part of the fun of the character, because if you had powers, who among us wouldn't necessarily try and make a few bucks doing that? And there's a line coming up. I probably shouldn't say this, but there's a line coming up in Blue and Gold where he says, "Look, you know, I wasn't born a bazillionaire like Batman was, and I'm not a highly paid journalist like the Kent guy. I got to do something to make money." And really, that I think is the story of who he is.
Yeah, I mean, he's long been a favorite of mine. I think like it started because I mean, I was late to the Booster Gold ongoing that you did, but the Justice League by Keith Giffen, J.M. DeMatteis, and Kevin McGuire, like that Justice League book is like one of my favorite Justice League runs of all time. And the combination of Booster Gold with Blue Beetle is just one of my favorite pairings in comics. So when I heard that you were launching a Blue and Gold book, my excitement level was up to here. I would love to hear how that finally came to be, because I think it's a book a lot of people, at least that I'm friends with, have been asking for. Like they've always been like, when are they going to do a book with these two? When are we going to see the return? Because Ted was dead for quite a while, after Infinite Crisis. So can you share a little bit about how the book came to be and kind of what your plans with it going forward are going to be?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, first of all, there have been a couple of times throughout my career when I was supposed to do Blue and Gold. And the first one was back like in 87, I think, somewhere in there. Because, yes, it's obviously a natural. If we look at the history of, say, buddy movies, whether it's like Lethal Weapon or years earlier with Hope and Crosby and the Road 2 movies, I mean, there's something about that always is, I think, attractive to the audience, right? And even in
Mhm.
comics, we had Green Lantern and Green Arrow, we had Power Man and Iron Fist. I mean, we all think of those, I think, fairly fondly. And so Booster and Blue Beetle were obviously tight in the Justice League, and we'd always had um, various points where I was supposed to go do this book, and then something would happen and it never came about. And so I want to get back to late 2019. Dan DiDio and I were talking about it. I said, look, this can be so much fun. It's Ted, it's Booster. Um, it can tell stories a different way than much of everything else DC is doing, because we tend to get our characters tied up in so much tragedy and turmoil and angst and overall, huge storylines, that I think there's a place to do something that focuses a little more on character and the fun of these guys, and do it as a buddy movie on paper. And we started discussing it then. And, despite all the changes at DC, the conversations stayed alive. And now we have a book coming out next month.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about the story of what we can expect, and then in turn, and like, will there be another? Well, not another. Are there plans further past this initial miniseries if the sales are there?
Yeah, this is an 8-issue series. It's being drawn by Ryan Sook, and the stuff he's doing is just absolutely gorgeous. His most recent stuff has pretty much been on the Legion book that Brian Michael Bendis was writing. And, this gives him a few less characters to have to focus on. But he's doing gorgeous stuff. And really what this is now is the story of a couple of characters coming together to do what they can to help people out in a very different way. And I don't want to give too much away here, but it is going to kind of, I think, reframe them and the way they work within the DC universe coming up here, and also how they do interact with social media and things like that now, just as any of us do, or any hero, I think, would have to. It's a strong part of the book. We have 8 issues to tell these stories, and I think, obviously, I would like to see it continue from that. I think we're going to provide a real healthy cornerstone so that can happen if readers respond.
Okay, well, I hope everybody listening and watching, you go pick up that book because I want to see a lot of Blue and Gold moving forward. Very excited for the book. Ryan Sook's like one of my favorite artists. I think he's absolutely killing it. I mean, I remember when he did a Spectre book when Hal Jordan was a Spectre, and that's where I first just stuff. And from there, he's just, I mean, insane how good he is.
Yeah, and he and I have worked together a couple of times. He did the first issue of Batman Beyond back when I was writing that. He was doing all our Futures End covers, which was a weekly when I was doing that. We did an issue of Action Comics together when I was writing Action. So we've worked together a few times, and I just have incredible admiration for his artistic skills, his storytelling skills, and everything else, and the commitment he brings to it. So the book is looking sharp. And I think when the first issue comes out, I'm pretty confident that people are going to give it some let me say that again, some strong thumbs up. There we go.
Yeah, I mean, I work in a shop, so I'm going to be pushing the hell out of that book when it comes, for sure. So, you know, you mentioned Batman Beyond. You just wrapped up a massive run on that book. Can you share a little bit about like why that book? Like, why write Terry McGinnis? Was that a character that kind of intrigued you based on the like cartoon, or just kind of how you ended up on the book, and what was your time like on that book, writing such a substantial run?
Yeah. Well, we had been doing the weekly book called Futures End, and you know that was Brian Nazarello, Jeff Lemire, Keith Giffen, and I as writers, a host of artists. And as part of that, we brought Batman Beyond into, I think, the more continuity intensive DCU. And as we were bringing that book to an end, Dan DiDio asked me if I wanted to write a Beyond ongoing. And I liked McGinnis, but what really attracted me more is this idea of it's a book that is set, you know, say 40 years in the future, where you can start to tell stories using classic elements of DC continuity without being bound by DC continuity. And I really like the setup for that. The circumstances were just right. And as I got into it more and more, it's something that I really started to have a lot of fun with. And this idea that, you know, here we have a future world. So eventually I could do a story, for example, where we see, you know, Damian Wayne having taken over for Ra's al Ghul and all grown up and older, things like that. And so, you know, anytime you have that opportunity to play with some of the toys, but be able to change the toys a little bit, there's something about that I find very attractive. So I ended up doing it much longer than I would have guessed going into it. I really enjoyed it.
And is there do you know if there's any plans with the character now that this run has ended, or is it just going to be a break for now?
Yeah, if there are plans, I'm unaware of it. I know I don't have any plans. So as far as DC, I cannot answer for them.
Okay, all right. And then in terms of like, you know, you are a writer artist, but how do you approach a book when you're writing and drawing, or as opposed to when you're just doing one or the other?
If I'm both writing and drawing it, there's an element of shorthand that goes into it. You know, so if I'm writing the story, I don't have to break it down with as much detail for me as I would for another artist, even though I work plot first because I believe that's generally better. I still don't have to give as much detail to me as I do to someone else who's drawing it, of course.
Right.
So there is that. And then I'm also more likely to make some changes as I draw, or I'll fine tune the story even as I work on it. It's more of a cohesive process rather than two different tasks. If I'm writing for someone else, I give them a little more information. I always try and give artists I work with latitude to be able to express themselves. Whether it was Patrick Zurcher on Action, whether it's Ryan Sook on Blue and Gold, and everybody in between, I try I give them the skeletal structure of the story. but allow them to take over more control of the storytelling and the highly dramatic moments on the page, because I think you get better comics that way. I think we saw that throughout Marvel's history. I still believe that now. I think it makes for more visual comics. At the same time, when I'm drawing for someone else who has written this story, I try and find out what it is that's important to them, what they see as the key moments, but I also try and inject some aspect of my own personality into it, because, comics are a collaborative medium. Even if you write and draw, you're still going to have a letterer. You're still going to have a colorist, most likely. So I think that comics are best shaped when you have that real essence of collaboration that goes on with them, and that you get everybody sort of moving in the same direction.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just interesting to me because since you do it all, and I see, like, you just had a book come out also at Marvel this week, One of the Heroes Reborn tie-in, so you drew that. You've also done a lot of stuff at Marvel. I mean, not just DC. I'm more your DC stuff is what I've always read more of, because DC's kind of always been in my reading a little bit above Marvel, even though I love them equally. DC, I was always a DC kid growing up. So
Okay.
I'm just curious, besides Blue and Gold, what else do you have in the works?
Well, as you noticed, Marvel Double Action, which is part of the Heroes Reborn effort starring Nighthawk, just came out. I have just got done writing a story for the Aquaman 80th celebration issue that's going to be giant size, coming out in a couple of months, that Steve Epting is drawing. And he and I had worked on Aquaman right around 2000, I think, somewhere in there. So this is us getting back together quite a ways later to do another Aquaman story. I just started today drawing something else for Marvel that we can't quite announce yet. So that'll come out soon, or the news of it. So I've got plenty. It's just a matter of getting it all organized here.
Okay, well, I'm very excited to see everything you have in the works. Blue and Gold is a book that I'm highly anticipating, so I can't wait to finally get it in my hands. Before I let you go, though, I was wondering if you could share maybe some, some of the books that you've read recently that you're really digging, some creators that you're really into, and then after that, just share where we can find you online, and I'll drop those links down below.
Sure. Well, as far as the online stuff, the best place to find me is at one of two. One is danjurgens.com. That's my website. The other one would be at the Dan Jurgens at Twitter. So that's where you can find me there. As for what I'm reading and enjoying right now, it's interesting because there's so much out there. Some of the new Image stuff that's coming out. Jeff Johns just had a book coming out from Image now, and I think 2 issues are out now, and I've really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed all Batman. And everything that James Tynion has been doing has been on a strong run for the last couple of years. I think the Spider-Man stuff that I'm seeing out of Marvel right now has been on this incredible run that just seems to be picking up steam. I think Hulk has been on a real roll at Marvel, where it too has been picking up steam. It's like, man, it's not just like a good issue here or there. It's like there's momentum here. I also see that at DC with, I think, the potential of the Infinite Frontier stuff. So I think there's a lot of really good, positive things happening right now, and that's great to see.
All right, cool. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing some stories. It was a blast talking with you, and I'm looking forward to doing this to you again sometime.
Okay, very good. My pleasure, Ryan.